All right, listener, today we're going to tackle a real head-scratcher, feminist epistemology.
Hmm?
We're going to be looking at how something as, I don't know, as seemingly personal as gender can actually, like, shake the very foundations of how we understand knowledge itself.
Hmm.
And to help us navigate through all of this, all these intricate ideas, we have a true expert on the subject. So are you ready to get philosophical with us?
Absolutely. We've got a fascinating article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to unpack here. And trust me, this isn't just some, niche philosophical theory. Feminist epistemology, this has some serious implications for how we look at knowledge, like in every field.
Okay, I'm intrigued already, but before we dive into the deep end, I think we need to set the stage a little bit. For our listener who might be thinking feminist epistemology, isn't that just about women's knowledge?
Yeah, that's a common misconception. Feminist epistemology goes way beyond just that. It's not just about like what women know, but it's about how gender as like a social experience, shapes the process of knowing itself. It asks, the questions like who gets to be considered a knower? Whose experiences and perspectives are valued? How do power dynamics, how do those influence what we even consider to be knowledge?
Whoa, you're framing this as like a real challenge to like traditional epistemology. I
Yeah.
can see how this would get any philosopher's gears turning.
Exactly. Think about it. Traditional epistemology, they're always striving for this ideal of objectivity. This view from nowhere is what some philosophers call it. But feminist epistemology comes along and says, hold on a second. There's no such thing as a view from nowhere. We all come to knowledge from like a particular standpoint. We're shaped by our experiences, our social locations, and yes, our gender.
Okay, so that's a pretty radical starting point.
Yeah.
It's like saying that our social identities aren't just like incidental, they're fundamental to how we actually know the world.
Precisely. And one of the key concepts that kind of comes out of this is situated knowledge. This is the idea that knowledge is always shaped by the knower's unique perspective, their social and historical context.
Okay, I see where you're going with this, but can you give me like a concrete example?
Yeah.
Help our listeners really grasp the significance of situated knowledge.
Absolutely. So imagine a doctor. This doctor is diagnosing a patient with like chronic pain. The doctor is going to rely on medical textbooks, diagnostic tools, and all of their training to understand what's going on with this patient. But the patient, they're bringing a whole other dimension of knowledge to this, right? The lived experience of pain, the emotional and social impact of illness, the challenges of even navigating the healthcare system. Both perspectives are valuable, but they're coming from different standpoints, different ways of knowing.
That's a powerful example. It really highlights how different perspectives can lead to like different understandings of the same phenomenon. And I can see how this idea of situated knowledge could apply to all sorts of domains, not just medicine.
Exactly. This could be applied to anything, from how scientists design experiments to how historians interpret historical events. Our standpoints, our social locations, they always influence what we see and how we understand it.
Okay, so we've established that knowledge is situated.
Mm-hmm.
But why is gender such a crucial aspect of this? I mean, why feminist epistemology?
That's where things get really interesting. Because gender, as feminist theory understands it, is not just about like biological differences, right? It's this complex system of social constructs. Roles, norms, expectations, power dynamics. These all profoundly shape our experiences and how we're even perceived by other people.
So it's not just about being male or female, but about all the baggage that comes with those categories.
Precisely. And think about how children are socialized from a very young age into different gender roles. Boys, they might be encouraged to be more assertive and competitive, while girls are told to be more nurturing and accommodating. These early experiences, they don't just shape their personalities, but also their ways of knowing, their values, even their beliefs about what's possible and what's appropriate.
Well, you're painting like a really vivid picture here of how gender can become almost this like invisible lens, like this lens we experience and interpret the world through.
Exactly. And feminist epistemology shines a light on that lens, helping us see how it can distort our understanding of knowledge itself.
Okay, my philosopher brain is like starting to sizzle.
Yeah.
So how does feminist epistemology actually go about analyzing and challenging these gendered ways of knowing?
Well, there are three major approaches within feminist epistemology that have emerged over time: feminist standpoint theory, feminist postmodernism, and feminist empiricism. And each of these offers like a different lens, a different set of tools for understanding how gender influences knowledge.
Okay, let's unpack these. Starting with feminist standpoint theory, what's the core idea there?
Okay, so feminist standpoint theory argues that the perspectives of marginalized groups, including women, offer unique and valuable insights into social phenomena precisely because they are marginalized. And it draws a parallel here to Marxist standpoint theory, which claims that the working class, by virtue of their position in the capitalist system, actually have a clearer understanding of how that system operates.
So it's not about romanticizing oppression, but about recognizing that those who are marginalized often have a more critical understanding of the structures that oppress them.
Exactly. They're forced to see the cracks in the system, the contradictions, the ways in which power operates to maintain inequality. And feminist standpoint theory, it argues that women, due to their experiences of sexism and patriarchy, have a unique standpoint that allows them to see things that those in positions of power might miss.
That makes sense. But I've heard some philosophers criticize feminist standpoint theory for being too essentialist. The idea that there's a single women's standpoint when women's experiences are so diverse. What do you say to that?
That's an important critique, and it's one that, feminist standpoint theorists themselves have really grappled with over time. The idea isn't to suggest that all women have the same experience or perspective. It's about recognizing that there are shared experiences of oppression, shared struggles against patriarchy that can actually generate a particular kind of knowledge or critical awareness of how power operates.
So it's not about erasing individual differences, but about recognizing that there are also commonalities that arise from being positioned as women within a patriarchal society.
Precisely. And this brings us to another important approach within feminist epistemology: feminist postmodernism. Postmodernism, as you know, is all about deconstructing grand narratives, challenging universal truths, and embracing the fluidity and multiplicity of perspectives.
Okay, so how does feminist postmodernism apply this framework to the question of gender and knowledge?
Well, feminist postmodernists take those critiques of essentialism even further. They emphasize the socially constructed nature of reality, including the category of woman itself. They argue that the idea of a universal woman is a fiction, a product of power relations that obscures the vast diversity of experiences and identities among women.
I can see how that critique is essential, especially given the history of feminist thought, often centering the experiences of white middle-class women.
Exactly. And feminist postmodernism, it pushes us to be more attentive to those differences, to recognize the intersectionality of gender with other social categories like race, class, sexuality, and ability.
So it's about acknowledging that there's no single feminist standpoint, but rather a multitude of perspectives that need to be heard and engaged with.
Precisely. Feminist postmodernism encourages us to engage in what's called world traveling. It's trying to see the world from different standpoints, even if we can never fully inhabit them.
I love that concept. It suggests this ongoing process of challenging our own assumptions, like decentering our own perspectives, being open to the radical multiplicity of ways of knowing.
Exactly. And it's a process that can be both, intellectually stimulating and profoundly transformative.
Okay, so we've got standpoint theory, which emphasizes those unique insights of the marginalized, and we've got postmodernism, which challenges that very idea of fixed or universal standpoints. Where does feminist empiricism fit into all of this?
So feminist empiricism, this one might seem like the odd one out, because empiricism is traditionally associated with objectivity, neutrality, the pursuit of value-free knowledge. But feminist empiricists would argue that even scientific inquiry, which strives for objectivity, can be influenced by the social and cultural values of the researchers.
It's about recognizing that science isn't always as neutral and objective as it claims to be.
Precisely. Feminist empiricists would point out that the questions we ask, the methods we choose, and even how we interpret data can be influenced by our unconscious biases and assumptions, including our gendered assumptions.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, if we're all coming from a particular standpoint, as you said earlier, then scientists can't just magically escape their own social and cultural conditioning.
Exactly. And feminist empiricists are interested in uncovering those hidden biases, showing how they can distort scientific findings, and advocating for more rigorous and inclusive methods that account for the diversity of perspectives.
So it's not about throwing out the scientific method altogether. It's about making it more rigorous, more self-aware, and more responsive to the ways in which gender can influence the pursuit of knowledge.
Precisely. Feminist empiricism is about holding science accountable to its own ideals of objectivity and rigor, while recognizing that achieving those ideals requires a critical examination of the social and cultural contexts in which science is actually practiced.
This is all so fascinating. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here, but I'm already seeing the philosophy of science in a whole new light.
And that's just the beginning. Feminist epistemology has some really profound implications for how we think about knowledge across all disciplines.
All right, listener, I don't know about you, but I'm already feeling like some of my philosophical assumptions are being shaken up here. And we've only just begun.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into how these different approaches to feminist epistemology have actually played out in specific scientific
Oh, I
disciplines.
can't wait. This is going to be good. Okay, listener, we're back and we're ready to go even deeper into this world of feminist epistemology. And if you're just joining us, we've been talking about how gender influences like the very process of knowing. And now I'm really eager to see how these like theoretical frameworks, how these actually play out in real world science, like in actual scientific practice.
Yeah, that's a crucial next step. Because let's be honest, the ivory tower of philosophy can sometimes feel a world away from like the messy, complex realities of scientific research.
So how does feminist epistemology bridge that gap? How does it go from like abstract concepts to concrete interventions like in actual scientific practice?
Well, there's a key distinction to keep in mind here. Feminist science criticism versus feminist science.
Ooh, a distinction. I'm all ears. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so feminist science criticism, this focuses on identifying bias as like error. It analyzes how gender bias, how this can lead to like flawed scientific conclusions, how it can perpetuate harmful stereotypes, and even how it can hinder scientific progress.
So it's about shining a spotlight on those moments where science has kind of, gone astray,
Uh,
often in ways that reinforce like gender inequality.
Exactly. A classic example is research on sex differences, right? The kind of research that exaggerates or misinterprets differences between men and women. You know, those studies that claim to find like biological bases for why women are supposedly more emotional or men are supposedly better at math.
Ugh, yes, those
Yeah.
studies. I always find myself, getting a bit skeptical when I counter those types of claims.
And you have good reason to be skeptical. Feminist science critics have done a lot of work to meticulously expose the methodological flaws, the biased interpretations, and even like the cultural assumptions that are just baked into a lot of those studies.
It's like they're starting with the conclusion they want to find and then working backward to like fit the data to that narrative.
You hit the nail on the head. And feminist science critics, they're not just pointing fingers, they're doing the crucial work of developing more rigorous methods, asking different questions, demanding more nuanced interpretations of the data.
That is essential work. But what about feminist science itself? How is that different from feminist science criticism?
Okay, so while feminist science criticism focuses on identifying and correcting like errors stemming from bias, feminist science takes those identified biases and uses them as a resource to generate new insights and challenge traditional assumptions.
So it's not just about critiquing bad science. It's about like actively creating a more inclusive, a more insightful, and dare I say, a more feminist scientific enterprise.
You got it. It's about asking different questions, developing new methods, exploring alternative frameworks, ones that center the experiences and perspectives of those who have been traditionally marginalized by science.
Can you give me a concrete example of how this might play out in a specific scientific field? Something to really bring this idea to life for a listener.
Absolutely. Let's take primatology, the study of primates. Traditionally, this field focused heavily on like male dominance hierarchies, which reflected, the researchers' own assumptions about how social structures work.
It's like they were projecting their own cultural biases onto the animal kingdom.
Exactly. But then feminist primatologists came along and they started asking different questions. They started observing female primates more closely, paying attention to their social behaviors, their relationships, their strategies for survival and reproduction. And what they found completely challenged the dominant, that male-centered narrative.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What did they find?
Well, they discovered that female primates have these like complex social dynamics, these intricate alliances, and sophisticated strategies for navigating their social world. They found that female choice plays a crucial role in mating, and that females often wield considerable power and influence within their
Whoa,
groups.
that's a real paradigm shift. So, by incorporating a feminist perspective, these researchers actually expanded our understanding of primate behavior.
Mhm.
They didn't just like critique existing research, they actually produced new knowledge.
Exactly, and this is just one example. Feminist science is transforming fields like biology, psychology, anthropology, even physics. It's challenging traditional assumptions, it's generating new insights, and it's creating a more inclusive and insightful understanding of the natural world.
This is so inspiring. It feels like feminist science isn't just about like adding a few women to the lab. It's about like fundamentally changing the way science is done.
You got it. It's about challenging power dynamics, acknowledging the influence of our social locations, embracing a more holistic and nuanced approach to understanding the world around us.
But I can already hear some of our more, like, skeptical listeners out there raising an eyebrow. You know, those folks who might say, hold on a minute, isn't this whole idea of feminist science a bit, well, subjective? Doesn't it threaten the objectivity of scientific inquiry?
Ah, yes, the classic science should be value-free argument. It's a common critique leveled against feminist epistemology, but it's one that feminist philosophers of science have really tackled head-on.
Okay, I'm ready for a good philosophical debate. How do feminist epistemologists respond to this critique?
Well, one of their most powerful arguments draws on the concept of the underdetermination of theory by evidence.
Ooh, that sounds complex. Break it down for me and our listeners. What does underdetermination mean, like, in this context?
Okay, so it means that the available evidence often doesn't fully determine which scientific theory we should accept. In other words, multiple theories can fit the same data.
So there's often, like, room for interpretation, for, like, judgment calls
Yeah.
in how scientists choose between competing theories.
Exactly. And that's where values can legitimately enter the picture. Feminist empiricists, they argue that it's perfectly justifiable to choose the theory that aligns best with feminist values, as long as it also fits the evidence.
So it's not about ignoring the evidence or letting our biases run wild. It's about acknowledging that values actually play a role in how we interpret and prioritize scientific findings.
Precisely. And feminist epistemologists argue that being transparent about those values, rather than pretending they don't exist, actually leads to more rigorous and responsible science.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm starting to see how feminist epistemology isn't about undermining scientific objectivity. It's about, like, redefining what objectivity means in a more nuanced and inclusive way.
Exactly. And that leads us to kind of a deeper question that feminist philosophers have been grappling with. What about the very concept of objectivity itself? Is it even possible to achieve, like, a truly objective view of the world, free from all bias and all social influence?
Ooh, that's a big one. I have a feeling feminist philosophers have pretty radical thoughts about this.
They certainly do. Feminists have critiqued dominant notions of objectivity, arguing that they often mask the ways that our values and assumptions are actually shaping our understanding. That classic idea of the view from nowhere, a perspective that transcends all particular viewpoints that's seen as both illusory and potentially harmful.
Because such a view is impossible to achieve. We're all coming from somewhere, as you said, with our own baggage, our own blind spots.
Exactly. And pretending to be completely objective, that can actually make us less objective because it prevents us from critically examining our own biases and assumptions.
So how do feminist philosophers propose that we rethink the very concept of objectivity? Do they just, like, throw it out the window altogether?
Not necessarily. They offer, like, alternative conceptions of objectivity that emphasize procedures and practices rather than, like, that mythical neutral standpoint. For example, reflexivity is crucial.
Reflexivity, right. That's about, like, critically examining our own biases and assumptions.
Exactly. It's about constantly questioning our own perspectives, seeking out alternative viewpoints, being willing to revise our beliefs in light of new evidence and insights.
So it's not about achieving, like, some kind of godlike detachment from the world. It's about being more self-aware, more critical, more open to different ways of seeing things.
Precisely. Another important concept is democratic discussion. Feminist epistemologists argue that a more objective understanding, this emerges when, like, a diverse community of inquirers engages in open and critical dialogue, holding each other accountable and challenging each other's biases.
I love that idea. It suggests that objectivity isn't something we achieve in isolation, but rather through a collaborative and inclusive process of inquiry.
Exactly. Feminist conceptions of objectivity embrace pluralism, and they aim for, like, a more responsive and inclusive scientific community where different perspectives are valued and debated.
This is also fascinating, but it also raises some kind of unsettling questions about how power dynamics impact not just, like, the content of knowledge, but who even gets recognized as a knower in the first place.
You've hit on a crucial issue there. Feminist epistemology has done, like, groundbreaking work on the topic of epistemic authority and how that is impacted by gender and other social hierarchies.
All right, listeners, so we've been talking about how feminist epistemology is, like, reshaping our understanding of knowledge, objectivity, and even science itself. But now I want to get to the heart of the matter. How does all of this affect, like, who gets to be considered a knower? An authority, like a voice worth listening to?
Yeah, that's a crucial question. And it leads us to one of the most powerful and disturbing insights of feminist epistemology, the concept of epistemic injustice.
Epistemic injustice. I'm not familiar with that term. Can you, unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, so it describes the ways that people are unfairly denied credibility or recognition as knowers simply because of their social identity. Their gender, their race, their class, their sexuality, or other marginalized status.
So it's not just about individual prejudice, but about how entire groups of people can be systematically silenced or dismissed, like their knowledge and their experiences are deemed less valuable or trustworthy.
Exactly. And the philosopher Miranda Fricker, who's done, some groundbreaking work on this topic, she distinguishes between two key types of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into these. Let's start with testimonial injustice. What does that involve?
All right, so testimonial injustice. This occurs when someone's testimony, their account of their own experiences, their knowledge, claims this is unfairly discounted or dismissed due to prejudice against their social group.
Can you give me a concrete example, something that'll really hit home for our listener?
Sure, imagine a woman, right, and she's reporting sexual harassment to her supervisor. She describes the inappropriate behavior, the unwanted advances, the hostile work environment. But her supervisor, influenced by sexist stereotypes about women being overly sensitive or prone to exaggeration, he doubts her account. He might question her motives or minimize the severity of the behavior or even suggest that she's misinterpreting the situation.
That's a heartbreaking, but all too common scenario.
Yeah.
And I can see how this kind of injustice, it doesn't just harm the individual woman, but it also contributes to a broader culture of silence around sexual harassment in general.
Precisely. Testimonial injustice, it allows perpetrators to continue their behavior unchecked. It silences victims, and it prevents them from seeking justice or support. And it reinforces harmful stereotypes that further marginalize women and other vulnerable groups.
It's like a vicious cycle. The more women are disbelieved and dismissed, the less likely they are to come forward, and the more of those harmful stereotypes are just reinforced.
Exactly. And this type of injustice, this can have profound implications for our understanding of knowledge itself. Because when entire groups of people are systematically excluded from the conversation, when their voices are silenced or their experiences are invalidated, our collective knowledge base, this becomes distorted and incomplete.
We miss out on crucial perspectives,
Yeah.
alternative ways of seeing the world. Okay, so what about hermeneutical injustice? How is that different from testimonial injustice?
Okay, so hermeneutical injustice. This goes even deeper. It occurs when someone lacks the, conceptual tools or language to make sense of their own experiences because their social group has been excluded from participating in the creation of knowledge and meaning.
So it's not just about individual acts of prejudice. It's about how entire systems of knowledge production can be structured in ways that, silence or marginalize certain groups.
Exactly. It's about who gets to define the terms, who gets to frame the debates, who gets to decide what even counts as knowledge in the first place.
Can you give me an example of how this might play out, in the real world?
Sure. Think about the history of medical research. For centuries, women were largely excluded from clinical trials. The standard human subject in medical research was male.
So medical knowledge was being built on a foundation that just excluded the experiences and perspectives of half the population.
Exactly. And this had profound consequences. It meant that diseases and conditions that primarily affect women, these were often understudied and underdiagnosed. And women's symptoms, they were often just dismissed or attributed to, psychological factors.
Wow, that's a stark reminder of how hermeneutical injustice can have real-world consequences for people's health and well-being.
Yeah, and it's not just medicine. This kind of injustice, this can be found in every field, from law to economics to education. When certain groups are systematically excluded from shaping knowledge, our understanding of the world just becomes distorted and incomplete.
So feminist epistemology isn't just about these abstract philosophical debates. It's about exposing and challenging these very real forms of injustice that shape our lives and our understanding of the world.
Precisely, and it's about developing strategies for resisting and overcoming those injustices.
Okay, so what are some of those strategies? What can we do to counter these forms of epistemic injustice?
Well, one promising approach is through the lens of virtue epistemology.
Virtue epistemology. Okay, tell me more about that. How does it relate to this issue of epistemic injustice?
Okay, so virtue epistemology, this focuses on the character traits and dispositions that contribute to, good knowing. It's about cultivating intellectual virtues that allow us to be more responsible, more reliable, and more just knowers.
So it's not just about like having the right knowledge. It's about being the right kind of person, intellectually speaking.
Exactly. And feminist virtue epistemologists argue that certain virtues are particularly crucial for resisting and overcoming epistemic injustice.
Like what? Give me some examples of those like epistemic virtues.
Sure. So epistemic humility is key. It's about recognizing the limitations of our own knowledge and being open to learning from others, especially those whose perspectives differ from our own. It's about being willing to admit when we're wrong and to revise our beliefs in light of new evidence and insights.
I can see how that would be essential for overcoming the biases and blind spots that lead to epistemic injustice. We need to be willing to decenter our own perspectives and listen to voices that have been traditionally marginalized or silenced.
Exactly. And it's not just about passive listening. We need to actively seek out those perspectives to create spaces where marginalized voices can be heard and valued.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Are there other virtues that that feminist epistemologists emphasize?
Absolutely. So open-mindedness is crucial. It's about being willing to consider alternative viewpoints, even those that challenge, our deeply held beliefs. It's about resisting dogma and embracing intellectual curiosity.
So it's about being willing to be challenged, to have our assumptions questioned, to step outside of our comfort zone.
Exactly. And then there's the virtue of intellectual courage. This is about speaking truth to power, challenging injustice, advocating for those whose voices are being silenced. It's about being willing to take risks, to stand up for what's right, even when it's unpopular or uncomfortable.
This is all so inspiring. It feels like feminist epistemology isn't just about like abstract philosophical concepts. It's about creating a more just and equitable world where everyone's knowledge and experiences are valued.
You've captured it perfectly. Feminist epistemology is ultimately about empowering marginalized voices, challenging oppressive structures, and creating a more inclusive and insightful understanding of the world.
Wow, listener, what a journey this has been. We've explored the complexities of feminist epistemology, from situated knowledge to epistemic injustice. And we've seen how these ideas are challenging traditional notions of knowledge, objectivity, and even science itself.
And remember, this is just the beginning. Feminist epistemology is a dynamic and evolving field, and its insights continue to shape our understanding of the world in really profound ways.
So, dear listener, we invite you to continue this exploration. Ask yourself, what assumptions about knowledge have you been taking for granted? How might these insights from feminist epistemology change the way you approach your own philosophical inquiries? How can you cultivate those epistemic virtues, that humility, that open-mindedness, that courage in your own life and work?
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
Until next time, happy philosophizing.